The Supreme Court has decided to bring back a Trump-era environmental regulation, funny way of putting it, that actually limits the state's role in enforcing the Clean Water Act. So essentially, the regulation is meant to, tie up the state as they engage in efforts to keep their water clean and safe for human use, essentially. Now, of course, Trump would do something like that, and it shouldn't surprise you that this conservative Supreme Court, where 3 of Trump's nominees were confirmed, would do what I'm about to describe. Because they didn't carry out this process in the typical way where they, hear arguments, they debate. That didn't happen. They did this in what's referred to as a shadow docket, and they did it through an emergency order without oral argument. Because, does a court really need to hear any oral arguments when it comes to something as small and insignificant as clean, safe water? Who knows? Now, New York Times reports that the so-called liberal justices, Elena Kagan, for instance, dissented with the majority decision. The court made this decision in a 5-4 vote, meaning the majority was in favor of implementing Trump's rules that would essentially allow for industries to pollute the water without the states being able to stop them. Justice Kagan said this: the applicants have given us no good reason to think that in the remaining time needed to decide the appeal, they will suffer irreparable harm. By nonetheless granting relief, the court goes astray. That renders the court's emergency docket not for emergencies at all. The docket becomes only another place for merits determinations, except made without full briefing and argument. And so she's really weighing in, John, on the fact that they did this through the shadow docket without hearing oral arguments, and also notably without giving any reasoning for why they voted this way.
Almost as if they don't want to go on the record as to what the reasons are. But thankfully for us and for our audience who follows this, I think we understand the reasoning quite well. If you're keeping score, shadow banning, bad, shadow docket, good, I guess. And but let's be fair. It's not that they didn't hear any oral arguments. They didn't hear oral arguments before the court, but they did hear the oral arguments made in terms of supporting business that they've heard from people like Donald Trump, Fox News, or I don't know, their spouses maybe weighed in at some point and talked to them about what they wanted. And that is unfortunately enough. And so we get this horrendous decision. And you were pointing out earlier in the show how important and significant elections are. All of these Supreme Court decisions are reminders of that. And we get to decide, is it more offensive when it's a 6-3 because that's such an overwhelming victory for the conservatives? Or is it worse when it's 5-4 because it's a reminder of how close we were just with Merrick Garland to potentially flipping a good number of these? Not everything. They would still, have the other seats, but some of these could have gone the other way. And these are incredibly consequential decisions, as I'm sure we'll get into, that are going to affect any number of different businesses as well as literally millions and millions of Americans.
Yeah, and we're gonna see a lot more decisions like this from the Supreme Court. One of the cases that they have agreed to hear, which is not a good sign, has to do with the regulations that were passed in the state of California pertaining to factory farms and the way that they treat livestock, right? So there were some regulations put in place to treat animals humanely, or as humanely as you can. That has been challenged, and all of these appeal courts have upheld the regulations. But now it's made its way to the Supreme Court, and the fact that the Supreme Court is willing to hear it means that they are, of course, open to basically striking down the regulations in California. Because again, at the end of the day, it's not about what's moral, what's constitutional, what's right. It's really just about upholding the best interests of corporations. And in this case, we're talking about the polluters in the country, industries that pollute our water. And in the case of the animal related regulations in California, it's about these massive factory farms and their ability to maximize profit while treating animals very poorly and also in a pretty disgusting way. So
exactly.
But But let's get into what the Clean Water Act is and what this really means. So first, a little bit of context. The Clean Water Act envisions a role for states in issuing permits for discharges into the nation's waters. Industry groups have long been frustrated by what the application called incongruities and ambiguities in an earlier regulation in place for 50 years, which they said had allowed states to drag out and effectively veto projects that make them a lot of money on the grounds other than the consideration of water quality. The groups welcomed the new regulation adopted in 2020 by Donald Trump, which narrowed the criteria for state certification, tightened deadlines, and stopped states from imposing what they called project killing conditions. So look, at the end of the day, this isn't about protecting clean water. This isn't about serving the best interests of the American people and keeping them safe. This is really about carrying out the best interests of corporations who don't want any red tape when it comes to their projects that could pollute water.
Exactly, although I think we can add a little bit of nuance to it. This is certainly a pro-corporate decision, but not necessarily in the way that it might seem. This is not about protecting all business, because not all business makes a ton of money by polluting waterways. Certain businesses make a lot of money by not having to abide by environmental regulations. So if you're a fossil fuel company, if you're producing coal and the various waste products that come from that, big pharma pollutes a ton. A lot of agricultural companies do pollution as well. On the other hand, there's a lot of smaller businesses that have a massive vested interest in access to clean water. Of course, we're setting aside that well over 100 million people, their access to clean water will be affected by the future of this. We're just ignoring that, I guess. No, but it's totally true. But think about big businesses in terms of food service and tourism, recreation. There's a lot of different industries that want and need access to clean water. And the thing is, really big business is always going to be able to pay to get access to the clean water they need. We were reminded of that in Flint. So while the regular people of Flint were drinking polluted water, the manufacturers that needed clean water, including car manufacturers, they were just paying more to get what they needed and then potentially polluting. They'll always have access. Small businesses that need access to clean water aren't necessarily going to be able to bear the financial burden of going to alternative sources of water. So this is a decision that is biased towards business, but not even business writ large. Honestly, it's like the top swath of business. This is truly like a 1% decision here.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. I really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.